not here to deny people a right. We're here to fix a wrong. They said it was over. Is it over? We're seeing something unprecedented in our island's history. We're putting aside our personal feelings about politics, our preference for a given political status, our differences in our place of birth, different languages, our differences in many ways, just to unite behind a single cause of Chamorro self-determination. We are the people of Guam who look out for each other, who respect each other, who understood that Chamorro hospitality and the half-a-day spirit was not an invitation to deny fundamental right to choose a political future. We are not dividers. We are uniters. We're not seeking to fight with others. We are promoting peace. That's why we are here arm in arm, step by step, marching, walking in the full view of our ancestors who came before us and are this moment watching us. Maila, come with us. Fanoki, Kahulu, Kalamtin, move forward with one clear voice that will not be silenced, that will be heard here in Adelup, over there in the federal courts, in Washington, D.C., in New York, wherever there are people who make decisions about us. They must hear the echoes of history, the cries for justice, the voices of the people who are gathered here this beautiful morning. Let them know that you are here. Are you ready? Biba Guahan! Biba Guahan! Nalagang louder! Biba Guahan!
Governor Huertas Leon Guerrero, Lieutenant Governor Josh Tenorio, distinguished guests, and all that are gathered here today, Talofalava from American Samoa. Kenneth, if you would allow me just a moment to say something in Samoan language. Tawina vele nei teimi e momoa na mamoli atu le angang whaafitai. Le nei komiti. I ia foi le atua i lona alofa ma lona anga lelei. Wa au li ai le nei aso mātango fie. O mawhai e loo sui, po loo tangata whātau wā. Tuina atu sfamtalanga mo Amerika Samoa. I heard a big applause for Mililani Trask. And we were in a meeting about 5 years ago when Obama passed the law on marine monuments. There were Native Hawaiians, Native Americans, and people from the territories were there. And the discussion was getting a little heated. And Mililani said, you know, if we have to go out on the streets and protest, then that's what we're going to do. And so everyone else was kind of chipping in on that. And when it was my turn, I said, well, thank you very much, Mililani. But as far as protesting, I just can't bear, or I couldn't bear the humiliation of my kids seeing me get arrested. And I'm grateful to Mililani because after that part of the meeting, she came up to me and said, thank you very much for expressing how you felt. So I went home and I told my kids about it. They were young at the time. About what I just said, and my daughter says, Dad, if you have to go and protest in the street, we'll support you 100%. So it is about courage. And I received an email before I came here, saying last week, the 3 task forces combined efforts to organize a historic march where more than 2,000 people gathered in support of Chamorro self-determination. Give your hands yourself. Give yourself a hand for that. So this is a conference about decolonization and seeing the issues at hand through the prism of decolonization. And just a statement from an attorney talking about American Samoa as a 116-year-old colony of the United States filled with non-citizens and controlled by a Congress where our delegate has no vote. I think all of you can understand that. But I would be remiss if I didn't tell you what it's like through the prism of the overwhelming majority of the Samoan people. We do not believe that we are under a regime that needs to be eradicated. We do not believe that we are a colonized people. And there is not a widespread yearning for independence in American Samoa. So let me tell you, let me try to explain why we think that way. I would say that a collective goal of this conference would be to move from a state of colonization to a state of decolonization, from a state of injustice to a state of true justice, from an uncertain pathway to securing what we need and want, to setting a clear direction where we fully exercise our right to self-determination and carry this duty out with knowledge, skill, and confidence. From the state of colonization to a political relationship or status firmly vested in the consent and authority of the people. I believe these are the goals that we share. In legal terms, what would decolonization look like? What if there were radical changes to the territorial framework? Imagine overturning the insular cases, amending the U.S. Constitution's territorial clause and equal protection clause, and overcoming the politics between U.S. political parties. This would cease the differentiation between states and territories, remove the unilateral authority of Congress over the territories, and provide the territories with the same level of representation in Congress. Changes like these would be no small miracle for the territories. Symbolically, it would mean that Guam, Puerto Rico, CNMI, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and American Samoa would be the 51st, 52nd, 53rd, 54th, and 55th star on the U.S. flag. I read an article called Blaming America, talking about the people of Guam as if they don't know what they want. You may have seen it. I won't say the author's name. You can Google it. He says this, yet Guam's rejection of a territorial constitution and demands for ethnic supremacy in the self-determination process is largely perceived in Congress and the executive branch as an indication Guam doesn't know what it wants or how to get it in relations with Washington. I propose to you that saying no is also knowing what you want. Further, saying no in itself can be an act of self-determination. In the long arc of times, it matters what you say no to. Why are we an unorganized territory? That's our political status. All the territories are unincorporated. American Samoa is the only territory that's unorganized. According to memos from Felix Keesing out of Stanford University and several other sources, in 1950, Guam proposed an organic act, And in that Organic Act, there were protective clauses, clauses that protected or wanted to protect the lands and language and culture of the Chamorro people. Congress labeled these un-American. And then you have the Organic Act that you have today. We have leaders called Matai. Matai are heads of family. When the Samoan Matai caught wind of this, they said this: if this is what you call an Organic Act, we want nothing to do with Organic Acts from now until the end of time. And ever since then, we have rejected proposals for an Organic Act. We took another route. The Samoans and the Americans who took our side helped us shape a constitution. In 1960, our constitution was approved by the Secretary of Interior. As you can imagine, there are many issues involved in a constitution that's approved by the Secretary of Interior. But in our constitution, we included what other Pacific peoples living in the U.S. territories could not get into their Organic Acts. Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution of American Samoa makes it the policy of our government to protect persons of Samoan ancestry against alienation of their lands and the destruction of the Samoan way of life and language. But we do have to confront the principle and legality of equality, especially in today's world when white supremacy has marched into the mainstream with torches and guns. When there are detention centers holding migrant families and children at the border. When U.S. prisons have incarcerated more people than any country in the world, with an inordinate percentage of them being people of color. Not to mention the systematic efforts to impact voting laws and gerrymander voting districts in ways that marginalize minorities. If we are to be judged by the content of our character and not by the color of our skin, then yes, equal protection of laws is absolutely necessary. The Constitution must be colorblind. Who can deny this? The water fountains you drink, the bathrooms men and women use, the lunch counters you're allowed to eat at, whether you sit at the front or the back of the bus, all these should not depend on the color of your skin. Nor should the scales of justice be weighed without blindfolds. The engraving on the entrance to the U.S. Supreme Court says equal justice under laws. And it's how education was made accessible to people of all races. So you have the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. Later on, there was the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. And the 26th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution expanded rights in the 1970s to 18-year-olds who were getting drafted to fight the war in Vietnam. This is America. This is the land of great egalitarian promise. But it's really hard to take, isn't it? To know that one of the most important and most inspiring amendments to the U.S. Constitution is threatening the survival and well-being of the indigenous people of our islands. We are faced with justifying on a rational basis our very existence as Native and indigenous peoples. Does the struggle for indigenous peoples of the unincorporated territories of the Pacific fall within the narrative of the nation's original sin? Or does it fall within the narrative of the mother of all injustices? I propose to you that we need the exception. We need the exception to the Equal Protection Clause. Or we need to rewrite the rules. I'm afraid to say there was not overwhelming solidarity in the court case that would have forced U.S. citizenship by judicial fiat on the people of American Samoa. Amicus briefs from scholars, governments, and other territorial leaders took the side that the court should decide for us whether we would become U.S. citizens. And it was looking like, I believe, they were using this court case as a vehicle for a strategy to overturn the insular cases. And if you examine the arguments, you will see that they were willing to play quick and easy with Samoan lands and culture. Excuse me. So the self-evident truth that Thomas Jefferson talked about was all men are created equal. That's the basis of the 14th, 15th, or 13th Amendment that banned slavery, the 14th Amendment that granted U.S. citizenship and had the Equal Protection Clause, and the 15th Amendment that guaranteed voting rights. I would say that we have self-evident truths of our own. They were not written down in books, but were passed down in oral traditions from generation to generation. They tell us that these islands are our home and must be protected for the ones we love, even for those yet to be born. No one takes the land with him or her. We are merely stewards of the land. And this is a misunderstanding you often see. We're not talking about private property. We're talking about the land of a people who are just stewards of the land. Because you and I will not be here one day, but the land remains. We have a compelling interest to preserve who we are as a distinct cultural community and to make fundamentally important decisions for ourselves. We have legally a compelling interest in preserving lands of Samoa for Samoans. Put it another way, the Samoans will defend their family lands with their very lives. Some have argued there is little to worry about, and then they cite court cases how we have very little to worry about. That the laws already exist to protect our lands, even saying that this will never happen. But from the perspective of the people who have the most to lose, there's a great deal of historical evidence that says otherwise. And please forgive me, I don't mean to offend anyone, but what happened to the Native Americans and their lands? What happened to the Native Hawaiians? What is happening to the Chamorro? The real danger is not equal protection in itself. It's the toxic mix of free market profiteering, artificially altered demographics, and legally sanctioned access that could set us down this slippery slope or deliver the fatal blow. We must exercise all the diligence we can to prevent this from happening. We understand our U.S. constitutional rights are limited, but for now, we prefer the compromise that limits enforcement of the U.S. Constitution, Equal Protection Clause, to limit the risk to Samoan lands. So I've called this a policy of deliberate distance. It can also be characterized as one of prevention. We have a saying in Samoa, manu manu I le upenga, ai leo le nau nau I le'a. You know, I've been sitting here wondering if the ancient Chamorro sailors ever made it to Samoa, or whether the Samoan sailors ever made it here. And I don't know. Now, Michael probably knows. In fact, you look like one of the ancient Samoan sailors. But I'm sure we share similar, because most of our proverbial expressions come from fishing, right? We're Pacific peoples. Manu manu ilu penga. Take care of the net and do not be so eager to go after the fish. We shouldn't be so eager to go after U.S. citizenship, lest we lose the net that allows us to protect our lands and ocean and skies. Prevention is better than cure. To borrow an analogy used to prevent the increase of non-communicable diseases, far better is it to prevent to build, far better to build a strong, solid fence at the top of the hill to keep from going over the cliff than it is to bring in emergency medical services at the bottom of it. I would say that saying no to U.S. citizenship for the people of American Samoa was an act of self-determination. No. If we're going to become U.S. citizens, let us decide that. Let us go through the process, the legal process and constitutional process of making that determination. And we see the federal courts in the same way. American Samoa is not part of the federal court system. Because if we become U.S. citizens, it's incumbent upon federal courts to protect the rights of U.S. citizens. Same thing with customs and immigration. It's under our local control. I do know that CNMI lost control of immigration, and that really says a lot about what the Commonwealth status means. And in history, I know that Guam also tried to regain control, because when you talk about artificial populating, that's what happens. And you can see it in Africa much more clear than it is here. You would think that by now in 2019 or 2017 that everything's fine in the educational system. That we are living in an enlightened age where our young people are being taught our history as it really happened and government. But I'm kind of concluded that you need to decolonize the educational system as well. So what more potent instrument is there for assimilating people than the educational system? We do have a Samoan Studies Institute at our community college, but we probably need a Michael Bevacqua to give it the same priority and focus on self-determination. So we needed to get support from the top. The governor issued an executive order establishing the office, and I made presentations to cabinet and to our legislature, and I got the blessings from the director of education. I didn't want to force it in. And then we have to look, are there any teachers here or education majors? So all of you know that, you have your curriculum objectives, you have your materials, you have the methods, and you have evaluation. So at each of those 4 stages, we had to figure out how we're going to incorporate more of the history and more of the issues about self-determination. Probably the hardest part was developing learning resource materials, because we grew up, and it's still true, reading only about U.S. history. Is it that way in Guam? And the attorneys in American Samoa told me they don't study any the insular cases in law school. It's not taught in law school. So it was key that we train the teachers. Because if the teachers don't buy into it, how can you expect them to teach the students that? So we went through a lot of this. Just in short, we're not there to teach them, come to my side, or anything like that. We're there, the educational system is there to teach students critical thinking. But there's a link between critical thinking and public judgment. Many of our people in Samoa, I don't know what it's like for you here, they vote out of emotions. They vote for family. They have a lot of that. But we need to try and get people to look at the consequences of their choices and make an informed choice and learn how to have a civil discourse, which is hard in this age of social media. How do we build self-determination? I think in American Samoa, we have to do it piece by piece. Ralph Abernathy said to Martin Luther King while they were in jail, we take it piece by piece. We build the path as we can, rock by rock. I'm no longer under the illusion that I'm going to save the day for American Samoa and change our political status. But my commitment has to be knowing that it will outlive me. You will hear me argue for Samoan lands and culture, but I don't want to live in a racist and intolerant society. Nor do I want my children or grandchildren to grow up in a racist or intolerant society. So we need to teach and practice what we preach about empathetic reciprocity, the golden rule. And we need to allow self-determination to happen in all realms and domains of life. Not everyone's going to become an activist for self-determination or an attorney that analyzes the insular cases. But everyone can practice self-determination in whatever walk of life that they choose. I work for a land grant program. Farmers can practice self-determination because farmers nurture and promote self-reliance, growing your own food. Artists are about imagination, creativity, and originality, and their work is about self-definition. We need our artists to do that. Musicians, let them be imaginative, because they can give you a vision of the future. So we have to remember that if we want to use the old word critical mass, I think that's from our time, Lieutenant Governor, critical mass. So we have to build critical mass because it will depend on the people who makes this final decision. We recognize there are many truths in our relationship and destiny with the United States. As we navigate the waters of an uncertain future, we cannot allow the political process to be solely dictated by others or taken completely out of our hands. It is a struggle we cannot afford to lose because future generations depend on it. Still, we believe ourselves to be fortunate. We are a people of great faith, and we believe Samoa and Momoa Leatua. Samoa, God is first. Thank you all. Soifua and farewell.
And I wrote a letter to the editor saying it's very important that we know our political status and that we help to provide public education to our people. And shortly after, I worked for the late Congressman Falemawaanga Eni Hunkin, and one of my tasks was to look into the political relationship between American Samoa and the federal government. Looked at the hopes, fears, and aspirations of the people of American Samoa. And looking at our deeds of cession, looking at our Constitution, looking at our relationship with the federal government or the application of the U.S. Constitution, looking at immigration and customs, and there are a couple of other main topics. And my method was to review the literature, look at all the laws and policies. If you were born in American Samoa, you're born a U.S. national. There is a naturalization process where we can become U.S. citizens. You have to go off island. There's kind of an expensive fee and a process. Like the other territories, we are unincorporated, meaning we don't have representation in Congress. We do have a congresswoman, but she cannot vote for when it's time to pass a law or reject a law. We're not under the federal court system. We control our own customs and immigration. And those are like the key, depending on how you look at it, they can be seen as democratic deficiencies, or you can look at it as this kind of gap that we choose to keep between us and the federal government.
I am very interested in making a presentation that you can really relate to and can really identify with our Puerto Rican brothers and sisters who I proudly represent in here. And I want to congratulate the people from Guam because you have two wonderful lioness warriors in charge of the decolonization process. So Governor Guerrero, Leon Guerrero, and the colleague from the Commission on Decolonization and Vice Governor, I greet you with a lot of pride in having these two women leading the process of decolonization in Guam. I'm going to talk to you. My presentation is about Puerto Rico actually today, with a little bit of background. And especially, I'm going to talk to you about the power of the people. After 121 years of U.S. colonialism, what happened during the summer of 2019 in Puerto Rico was anything beyond our expectations, our dreams, or wishful thinking. For those of us who have dedicated all our life to the struggle for decolonization and independence, an awakening of the masses of the people, a potent cry of indignation against corruption, discrimination, abuse of power, and economic exploitation. A rejection of the power exercised by the U.S. Congress by imposing a dictatorial fiscal oversight board per the legislation passed by the U.S. Congress known as promesa, which in Spanish is the word for promise, ironically. The only thing that they have promised us is poverty and inequality. The July 22, 2019 march demanding the resignation of Ricky Rosselló, the elected governor, by CNN and CBS estimates could have mobilized between 700,000 to 1 million people out of a population of 3.5 million people. The slogans chanted by the people are revealing. Ricky, renuncia y llévate a la Junta. In English means, Ricky, resign and take the board with you. Somos más y no tenemos miedo. In English, we are more and are fearless. Can we say it was an uprising against U.S. colonial rule? No, it was not. But all the demands that surfaced during the demonstration are unequivocally identified with the demands and the reivindications that the independence movement has been putting forward for decades. I will give you a broad background of what happened in the summer of 2019 in Puerto Rico. In 2007, an international economic crisis brought down financial giants in the United States. The mortgage bubble exploded, trashing prime and subprime bonds in the financial markets. Puerto Rico was already struggling as far back of the decade of the 70s. Puerto Rico had enjoyed some economic advantages during the years after World War II by participating in the U.S. economic boom after the war. Operation Bootstrap brought labor-intensive manufacturing industry to the island that aided in the creation of a middle class. But this change from an agricultural to an industrial society also brought with it massive migration and the almost disappearance of a subsistence economy. Agriculture had already been badly hurt by the devaluation in January 20 of 1899 by a 40% of the value of our then currency, the Puerto Rican peso. The foreclosure of farms, the substitution of a crop agriculture to a monocrop of sugarcane agriculture. The coming of the industrial age was the last nail in the agricultural coffin. We thus became importers of fruit from the US. Today, 85% of all our consumption is imported from the US. In 1996, Section 1936 that provided tax incentive to U.S. economist industry located in Puerto Rico was eliminated as a result of an intensive lobbying by the pro-statehood leaders of Puerto Rico. Massive layoffs ensued as the industries moved out. This was preceded by the adoption in January 1 of 1994 of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA. This took away the commercial advantage that Puerto Rico enjoyed with the U.S. vis-a-vis foreign countries like Mexico, for example. Economic growth had been stalling since 2006, a year before the U.S. financial crisis. Only Greece had a worse economic contraction of 28% loss of the gross domestic product. Puerto Rico has suffered a 14% of cumulative loss of the gross domestic product. The capacity of the Puerto Rican authorities to face the crisis is extremely limited due to the lack of the traditional instruments of macroeconomic policy. It lacks, first of all, autonomous monetary and exchange rate policies. This is the principal reason why the Commonwealth crisis has been compared to that of Greece, the Greece of the US. But due to the deep deterioration of the public finances, it also lacks the space to undertake a counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Finally, its subordinate political status makes it dependent on decisions by the U.S. Congress and federal courts without much of a voice on those decisions. This is taken from a report of the Center for the New Economy in Puerto Rico. A $167,846 million debt, a decade of negative growth, the adoption of austerity measures, the stripping of labor rights and benefits mandated by the Fiscal Oversight Board had already created a perfect storm, and then we were hit by two Category 4 to 5 hurricanes, Hurricane Irma and Maria, in September 6 and 20 of 2017. The electric infrastructure was completely wiped out. Months without electricity, weeks without drinking water, deteriorating health conditions, massive migration of around 90,000 people in 1 year, including young working and professional persons, had left the island in a sorry state. The U.S. and the colonial administration acted with criminal negligence. The situation was seen as a gold mine for the corrupt government of Ricardo Rosselló, who surrounded himself by insensitive, elitist, and incompetent officials and advisors whose only interest was in giving away lucrative contracts to their cronies. Life-saving aid received went to waste, like thousands of bottles of water, while people were exposed to deadly diseases such as leptospirosis that claimed the life of many for drinking out of creeks and other unfiltered waters. The exact number of deaths due to lack of access of life-saving equipment due to lack of electricity and health care will never be known. The numbers run from 3,000 to 4,000 people. The lack of care the U.S. and the colonial administration demonstrated throughout the humanitarian crisis may have killed some. But the survivors, like a saying of our ancestors, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And that's what happened in Puerto Rico. Our people have come out stronger out of this crisis and are not willing to bear any more abuses and lies. Where does all this leave the decolonization and independence movement? People realize that the U.S. is not their benefactor. President Trump's callous and insulting tweets against the people of Puerto Rico, calling us lazy, corrupt, and incompetent, not only at the government levels, but in general. His antic in visiting Puerto Rico and diminishing our humanitarian crisis by saying that compared to Katrina, we had not suffered anything significant. His throwing of paper towel rolls in a gathering and considering a joke to be laughed at. The insistence in lying about the amount of aid that was supposed to be received, saying that Puerto Rico has received more than any state, when in reality, out of the 92 billion promised, only around 70 billion has been actually received, much less than the states of Florida and Texas. Trump's action in delaying the disbursement of badly needed reconstruction funds, all of these actions of the President of the United States have confronted the people of Puerto Rico with the racist and imperialist reality of our relationship with the United States. The people of Puerto Rico have not rendered the fight for decolonization and independence in the 121 years of U.S. colonialism. We have faced crude repression and assassination, like the Ponce Massacre of March 21, 1937, in which peaceful protesters of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, led by Dr. Pedro Albizu Campo, were gunfired by the police under the commandment of U.S. Colonel Riggs. Incarceration of the Puerto Rican independence fighters was implemented in the 1930s, the 40s, and the 50s. When armed struggle was seen as an imperative answer to U.S. colonialism, a nationalist revolution took to the streets on October 30, 1950, together with an armed action against President Truman in the U.S. on November 1st, 1950. One nationalist was killed and another, Oscar Collazo, served prison for 29 years. In 1953, the U.S. managed to deceive the international community at the United Nations by passing Resolution 748-8, delisting Puerto Rico from the list of non-self-governing territories. By representing that we had exercised self-determination by adopting our own constitution and having elected local government. And by the way, that constitution had to be approved by the U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress took out sections of the Constitution and imposed others. The two most important things that the Congress did with the Constitution, one was to take out Section 20, which was literally a copy of the Human Rights Declaration of the United Nations. They did not allow for us to have at constitutional level the right to decent housing, to employment, to health, and to education at all levels. And the other amendment that they forced on our Constitution was to put the payment of the debt of the general obligations of the government as a constitutional imperative. It has a constitutional guarantee that when there are not sufficient funds, we have to pay first the debt, and then if anything is left, you can provide social services to the people. When in fact, under the Jones Act, it used to be the other way around. What it said under the Jones Act was that you had to give social services first and then pay the debt. So our Constitution is a federal law. It's not really a constitution. It's not really an exercise of self-determination. When we were delisted in 1953 as a response to the farce, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party staged an armed attack in the U.S. Congress. Four nationalists, led by Lolita Lebron, together with Rafael Cancel Miranda, Irving Flores, and Andrés Figueroa Cordero, attacked the U.S. Congress on the day of the 10th Inter-American Conference that was taking place in Caracas, Venezuela, and were refusing to discuss in that meeting the U.S. colonialism in Puerto Rico. In the 60s and 70s, Puerto Rico was a cauldron of activism against U.S. military service, student and labor strikes. The Nationalist Party leaders incarcerated had left a void that was soon to be filled by the Puerto Rican Independence Party, founded in 1946 and led by Don Gilberto Concepción de Gracia, and the Movimiento Pro Independencia, or Movement for Independence, led by Juan Mari Bras, founded on January 11, 1959. As the economic conditions started deteriorating in the 70s, labor activism gained momentum. Most of the labor unions at the time were led by Puerto Rican independence labor leaders. The 80s was marked by student protests at the emergence of clandestine groups for independence that staged successful attacks on U.S. military targets, such as the explosion of 9 U.S. military aircraft stationed at Muñiz Military Air Base, as what is known as Pitirre II. Dozens of pro-independence fighters were incarcerated and served from 19 to 34 years in jail for their activity, as in the case of Oscar Lopez Rivera. In 1999, we started a second round of struggle against the presence of the U.S. military maneuvers in the island of Vieques, in which, through disobedience, we stopped the bombings, and in 2003, the U.S. Navy finally left not only Vieques, but also the Roosevelt Roads station at Ceiba in mainland Puerto Rico. Nearly 1,500 people were incarcerated by the U.S. for civil disobedience activities between 1999 and 2003. While the resistance has continued uninterrupted in Puerto Rico and the U.S., the independence movement has at the same time managed to maintain a respected international presence in various state multilateral organizations such as the UN and the non-aligned movement, in social and political movements such as the Foro de Sao Paulo, the Socialist International, and in as many forums, congress, and conferences where colonialism and social justice issues are discussed. And here we are today, thousands of miles away from home, to exchange with our brothers and sisters from the Pacific Islands that share a history of U.S. colonialism with us in the Caribbean. What is the state of the movement of self-determination today? We are asked to answer. We are living in the awakening of our millennials and centennials who took to the streets in the thousands. The young women and men that led the demonstration are fearless. They faced police attacks with pepper spray and tear gas with defiance. They threw back the tear gas canisters to the police. They retreated and promised to come back each time, and they did it. Their motto, "Yo no me dejo," means I will not let you get me. They have stopped marching after effectively making the then Governor Rosselló resign, but are participating and organizing people's assembly all over the island, discussing how to achieve truly democratic rights, dissecting the public debt, and denouncing the illegality of the same, demanding that a state of emergency be declared to protect women from domestic violence, defending the University of Puerto Rico that has been defunded and tuition raised, proposing amendments to the Constitution of Puerto Rico to achieve fully participative democratic rights, and proposing a new constitution for a new country, debating decolonization options and mechanisms to achieve it, rejecting bipartisan, corruption, and cronyism. There is ample consensus on the convening of a constitutional status assembly in which no colonial and no territorial options will be represented by elected delegates. The options included are independence, free association, and statehood. Though the option for statehood had a momentous growth between 1968 and 2012, when it obtained the favor of over 800,000 voters, in the 2017 plebiscite held by the gone Governor Rosselló, in which his pro-statehood party participated alone due to all the opposition boycott, the voter turnout was only at 23% of those able to vote and obtained slightly over 500,000 votes, which represented a 97% of the participants. The corruption scandal that has surrounded the administration appears to have dealt a mortal blow against the pro-statehood movement. The September 1st, a group of statehooders called for a march in support of statehood, and per the newspaper's count, barely 500 people showed up. Millennials and centennials are saying that they do not support statehood as a decolonization option for Puerto Rico. Sovereignty in its options of free association has been garnering sympathies amongst ample segments of the population. A new political movement is trying to organize, register, and participate in the 2020 upcoming elections. Bipartisanship and representative democracy is rejected by the new generations. They demand participation, horizontal organizations. They are ecologically educated and reject consumerism. They prefer a rich family relation than material riches. They want time for sharing with friends and family, arts, travel, and reject capitalist rat race as a way of living. They are independent and solidarious. So as we look back at all the years and efforts of decolonization, having used all possible methods of struggle, armed, civil disobedience, elections, we find that everything has served to maintain a conscience of our singularity and uniqueness as a people, the love of our country, and the desire to make the best country possible for all. All the bets are on the U.S. recognizing Puerto Rico's right to sovereignty. Everything that the independence movement has denounced and predicted has become reality. The U.S. is practicing crude colonialism, and in the end, there's no other alternative than decolonization. In the words of independence leader Noel Colón Martinez, when the people united through direct and peaceful action decide to put an end to the tenure of the leader of a government that represents unconditional adherence to U.S. intervention in Puerto Rico, it must be considered as a profoundly decolonizing act of self-determination, similar to the movement that forced the exit of the U.S. Navy from our national territory. We are not merely a territory of the United States, we are a Latin America and Caribbean nation with a historical development that antecedes that of the United States. Thank you very much.
There was a legislation passed by the United States Congress also in 2016. So in 2016 we had the judicial power, the executive power, and the legislative power, the three branches of government of the United States, saying the same thing. We are not sovereign, so we can do with you whatever we want. And the legislation of Promesa starts by stating that the authority to enact it is drawn from the territorial clause. And it also speaks about the possibility of applying this legislation to other U.S. territory like Guam and American Samoa are included as the territories to which this act could be applied in any event that it was necessary. So PROMESA has one main and principal goal, and that is that the debtors, not the debtors, the creditors get paid, right? Who are the creditors? Well, Wall Street and the hedge funds. This legislation created this bankruptcy procedure to restructure the debt of the government of Puerto Rico to make sure that the creditors are going to get some money, not all their money, but some money. The people of Puerto Rico have learned that we as a people have the power. That when we decide to get together and we decide to achieve a goal united, united doesn't mean that you have to stop being who you are or stop belonging to the organization that you belong. United means that we agree that this is our goal at this moment, and you are consistent and you are committed to that goal, and you can achieve it.